They were supposed to be America's silver bullet against blitzkrieg. Fast, ruthless, unstoppable. Instead, they were open-topped coffins, vulnerable, under-armored, written off as a failed experiment. And yet, the M10, the Hellcat, the Jackson carved out kill ratios that shocked even their critics. Why did the Army erase their legacy just months after victory? The desert night in Tunisia was eerily still, broken only by the grinding echo of engines. Along a ridge near El Guettar, rows of American half-tracks crouched in the shadows, their crews tense, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Suddenly, a low rumble grew into a deafening roar, the approach of the German 10th Panzer Division. The earth seemed to shudder beneath the advance of steel. In the glow of a rising moon, the outlines of tanks emerged, menacing silhouettes moving in perfect formation, their guns like spears aimed at the heart of the Allied line. Inside one of the improvised machines, an M3 gun motor carriage, a young gunner clutched the breech of a French 75mm gun, bolted onto the open half-track. Sweat traced the dirt on his face despite the chill of night. He had trained for this moment, told that his weapon was the silver bullet against the armored beast. Yet staring down the looming shapes of panzers, he could not silence the thought. Was this really enough? The order came. A flash split the night. One by one, the American guns spat fire, their recoil hammering through thin steel hulls. German armor erupted in sparks, some burning, others shrugging off the hits and pressing forward with relentless fury. Shells whistled back, slamming into fragile vehicles that offered almost no protection. Men leapt from blazing wrecks, scrambling for cover as the line wavered. For a moment, it was chaos. Then, against all odds, the panzers faltered. 38 German tanks lay smoldering in the valley. Yet victory was stained with loss. 21 of the American destroyers were gone. Crews shattered, survivors staring blankly into the smoke-filled night. But this was only the beginning. To understand why the U.S. Army placed its faith in these fragile machines, we must return to the origins of the idea, back to the very birth of the tank destroyer. In the autumn of 1939, the world witnessed a new kind of warfare. Across the plains of Poland, columns of German panzers thundered forward with a speed and ferocity unseen in modern battle. Towns collapsed in hours, entire armies shattered in days. Less than a year later, the same storm swept into France. Once proud fortifications crumbled, and divisions that had trained for years were brushed aside in weeks. To Allied observers, it seemed as if the German tank had become an unstoppable predator, devouring everything in its path. For the United States, still outside the war but watching closely, the lesson was chilling. Traditional methods of stopping tanks, heavy artillery dug into the ground, slow-moving towed anti-tank guns, seemed utterly inadequate. The German blitzkrieg concentrated armored divisions on narrow fronts, punching deep into enemy lines before defenders even had time to respond. The question echoed through American war colleges. How could such a force be stopped once unleashed? Out of this anxiety was born a new doctrine. Instead of waiting passively behind static defenses, the U.S. Army would build mobile units whose sole purpose was to hunt tanks. They would not be bound to the plodding pace of infantry, nor bogged down by the responsibilities of a full-fledged tank division. They would be predators of predators, swift, lethal, able to appear where the enemy least expected. In 1941, the idea was tested in the Louisiana Maneuvers, the largest military exercises ever held on American soil. There, hastily improvised tank destroyers faced off against armored forces in a simulated war. To the surprise of many, these units performed brilliantly. They struck from concealment, shifted positions with speed, and left trails of destroyed tanks behind them. Critics argued the rules of the games had been skewed, but the impression was powerful. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, Chief of Army Ground Forces, became the doctrine's fiercest champion. To him, tank destroyers were the answer to blitzkrieg, a flexible counter that could blunt even the most terrifying armored thrust. Under his guidance, a dedicated tank destroyer command was established. A new training center rose in the dusty fields of Fort Hood, Texas, where crews drilled relentlessly in ambush tactics and mobile gunnery. Ambition soared. The Army envisioned more than 200 battalions, each a specialized spear to thrust at enemy armor. By the end of 1942, 53 battalions had already been mobilized, more than 40,000 men committed to this experiment in modern warfare. American newspapers wrote with confidence that a new anti-panzer force was in the making, a branch that would make the Desert Foxes of Germany think twice before driving their steel columns forward. Yet, even as the doctrine took shape, questions lingered. Could lightly armored vehicles really face Panthers and Tigers in open battle? Could a force designed solely to destroy tanks adapt if the enemy no longer attacked in great armored waves? Still, the momentum was unstoppable. A nation that had once lagged behind in armored warfare now proclaimed it had found the answer. The tank destroyer was not just a weapon. It was a promise. But promises are tested only in the fire of real war. And soon, across the sands of North Africa, the theory would be hurled against German steel. The birth of the tank destroyer force wasn't marked by sleek machines of steel and precision. It began with improvisation. Desperate measures crafted in workshops and depots, the Army rushing to give shape to its bold doctrine. The first of these creations was the M-Hex. At its core, it was little more than a 37mm anti-tank gun bolted onto the back of a 3/4-ton truck. Open, fragile, unarmored, it looked almost absurd. Soldiers who trained with it joked darkly that it was more likely to frighten its own crew than the enemy. Yet for a time, this ungainly contraption carried the hopes of a new kind of warfare. Not long after came the M3 gun motor carriage. Built on the familiar chassis of the M3 half-track, its front wheels and rear tracks carried a French 75mm gun mounted awkwardly on top. It was overloaded, top-heavy, and vulnerable. But it could move with speed, fire with power, and then slip away before the enemy could strike back. It was, in its own crude way, a predator in training. By 1942, these stopgap machines were already in combat. In the deserts of North Africa, crews of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion faced Rommel's seasoned panzers at El Gueter. They fought from behind ridges, dashing forward to fire before pulling back to new positions. Against the 10th Panzer Division, their M3s struck hard, leaving dozens of burning tanks littering the battlefield. Yet the price was steep. 2/3 of their own vehicles lay smoldering. The lesson was clear. Courage and speed could carry the day, but only at terrible cost. The Army needed something better. That answer came in the form of the M10 Wolverine. Built upon the sturdy hull of the M4 Sherman, but fitted with a new pentagonal turret and a long-barreled 76mm gun, the M10 was the first purpose-built tank destroyer. General Motors and Ford produced more than 6,000 of them, rolling from assembly lines that glowed day and night. For the crews who climbed into these machines, the Wolverine was a step forward, stronger, deadlier, with the promise of finally standing toe-to-toe with German armor. But the Wolverine carried its own burdens. Its armor was thin, its turret hand-cranked and slow to traverse, and its open top left crews dangerously exposed to shrapnel and small arms fire raining from above. For the men inside, every battle was a gamble between visibility and vulnerability. They could see more than their counterparts in Shermans, and often spotted the enemy first. Yet that same open sky was a constant reminder of their fragility. Then came the Hellcat. In 1944, Buick unveiled the M18, a machine unlike anything the Army had fielded. Light, sleek, powered by an aircraft engine, it could race across the battlefield at 50 miles per hour. Speed became its shield, mobility its armor. Crews loved it for its agility, calling it a joy to drive. But its protection was paper-thin, barely an inch of armor. Against a Tiger's cannon, it might as well have been made of tin. Still, the Hellcat embodied the essence of the doctrine. Strike first, strike fast, disappear before the enemy could reply. Finally, the M36 Jackson arrived, bristling with a formidable 90mm gun capable of piercing even the thick hides of panthers and tigers. Its shells could reach out across thousands of meters, tearing through steel that had once seemed invincible. For the first time, American crews felt they possessed a weapon that could truly match German might. Together, these machines charted the arc of the tank destroyer's evolution, from improvised stopgaps to specialized hunters. Each model carried within it the contradictions of the doctrine: speed traded for protection, firepower gained at the cost of survival. And as the battalions trained, drilled, and prepared, the stage was set for their ultimate test. The real question lingered in every crewman's mind. Would these creations, born of theory and necessity, hold firm when the full weight of German steel came crashing down? When the first battalions of tank destroyers were shipped across the Atlantic, the men who crewed them carried with them more questions than answers. They had trained in the dust of Texas and Louisiana, told they were the tip of the spear against Hitler's armored legions. But now, as their ships neared the shores of North Africa, the doctrine they had studied would be tested for the first time. Life in the early campaigns was anything but glamorous. In Tunisia, tank destroyer crews endured blistering heat by day and bitter cold by night. Their open-topped vehicles offered no shelter from sandstorms that scoured the desert or rain that turned encampments into mud. Many were young men fresh from American towns, mechanics, farm boys, students, suddenly thrown into a world where the horizon itself seemed to shimmer with menace. Their first missions were cautious, often little more than support roles. Instead of dashing ambushes against massed German tanks, they found themselves covering infantry advances or firing into distant hills suspected of hiding enemy guns. The M3s and M10s spat high-explosive shells more often than armor-piercing rounds, pounding dugouts and machine gun nests rather than dueling with tigers. Each pull of the trigger echoed the paradox of their existence. They were hunters designed for prey that rarely appeared. Yet the tension never eased. Every day carried the possibility that, beyond the next ridge, the dark shapes of panzers might materialize. Crews rehearsed their drills endlessly. Spot, traverse, fire, relocate. The gunners polished their optics, loaders stacked shells within easy reach. Drivers learned the feel of every gear. They knew that seconds could mean survival or annihilation. When not in action, the men lived like soldiers everywhere, waiting. They wrote letters home, played cards under the glow of lanterns, argued about baseball or girls they had left behind. But beneath the laughter was an undercurrent of dread. For they had heard stories of German armor, of tigers that shrugged off shells like raindrops, of panthers that prowled the hedgerows of Europe. They wondered whether their thin-skinned machines could truly stand in that storm. As the campaigns shifted north into Italy, the reality of the war pressed closer. Mountain roads twisted precariously, often too narrow for vehicles to maneuver. Tank destroyers crawled through villages reduced to rubble, their engines echoing off shattered walls. Crews grew accustomed to fighting not just the enemy, but the terrain itself. Their doctrine of open-field ambushes seemed increasingly distant, yet their role expanded. They were fire support, artillery, even mobile bunkers when the situation demanded. By the summer of 1944, the men who had survived North Africa and Italy found themselves staring across the English Channel. Operation Overlord loomed. On the beaches of Normandy, and in the labyrinth of hedgerows beyond, the tank destroyer would once again be put to the test. The tension among the battalions was electric. Some spoke with bravado, others kept their fears silent, but all felt the weight of expectation. The voyage across the Channel was heavy with anticipation. As the landing craft pitched in the surf, crews clutched the steel sides of their vehicles, engines rumbling, hearts pounding. They were about to drive into a storm of fire where every hedgerow might conceal an ambush, every field a lurking panzer. And yet amid the fear, there was resolve. These men were no longer the untested recruits of Fort Hood. They had seen combat, buried friends, endured the furnace of Tunisia and the mountains of Italy. They knew the stakes. They understood that their machines were flawed, that their armor was thin, that survival often depended on speed, cunning, and the courage to fire first. The road to battle had forged them into something harder than doctrine, more resilient than theory. They were tank destroyer men, half hopeful, half fatalistic, driving toward the clash that would define their very existence. The hedgerows of Normandy were alive with whispers of death. Narrow lanes twisted between walls of earth and tangled brush, corridors where visibility stretched no farther than a few yards. For the tank destroyer crews who rolled into this maze in the summer of 1944, every turn of the road could conceal the dark snout of a panther's cannon. The doctrine that had been born on the open plains of theory was about to be tested in Europe's green, suffocating labyrinth. On July 11th, near the city of Saint-Lô, the test came. At dawn, the Panzer Lehr Division launched its counterattack. German tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, surged forward to relieve pressure on their crumbling front. In the small village of Le Désert, M10s from the 799th and 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalions lay in wait. Their turrets creaked as gunners scanned the hedgerows, nerves straining, fingers hovering near triggers. The ground trembled. Then, like phantoms emerging from the mist, panthers appeared. The duel was brutal and swift. From hidden firing points, the Wolverines spat fire. Shells struck German armor, sometimes with lethal effect, sometimes glancing harmlessly off sloped plates. A single panther burst into flames, its hatch flung open as black smoke poured skyward. Another pressed forward, ignoring the sparks that danced across its hull. American crews frantically reloaded, every second stretching into eternity. Above them, the roar of Allied aircraft suddenly descended. Fighter bombers screamed low, unleashing rockets and bombs into the German columns. The sky itself seemed to collapse on the Panzer Lehr. When the smoke cleared, 30 German tanks lay silent among the fields, their hulks smoldering in the summer air. For the tank destroyer battalions, it was vindication, proof that they could stand against the beasts of steel. Yet the price was measured in burning wrecks of their own, and the silence of men who would never rise again. Only weeks later, the battlefield shifted to Mortain. In August 1944, 4 panzer divisions hurled themselves at the American line in a desperate attempt to cut off the Allied breakout. In the dawn fog, the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion held its ground. Their towed 76mm guns, dug into fields and concealed behind hedgerows, fired blindly at the muzzle flashes of approaching panthers. The duel was savage and close. Crews aimed by instinct, pulling lanyards again and again until the barrels smoked. 14 German tanks were destroyed in the chaos, though 11 American guns lay shattered, their crews killed or captured beside them. Reinforcements arrived, self-propelled M10s and M18s racing to the front, and together they blunted the German thrust. The battle raged for days, but Morton ended in disaster for the Wehrmacht. The tank destroyers, bloodied but unbroken, had played their part in sealing Germany's fate in France. Farther east, the Ardennes forest would provide the crucible of fire. December 1944, snow fell thick over the frozen ridges, muffling sound, cloaking movement. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Hitler's final gamble. Out of the forests poured tigers, panthers, and columns of infantry, crashing against American positions caught off guard. The roads choked with retreating vehicles, smoke rising from shattered villages. It was here that the tank destroyers met their greatest trial. At Noville, near Bastogne, a platoon of M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion charged headlong into German armor. The air was brittle with cold, the fields covered in white. Engines roared as the Hellcats sped across open ground, their crews exposed under open turrets, eyes locked on targets. They struck with precision, ambushing column after column. In a single day, 30 German tanks lay wrecked, their hulks burning in the snow. The Hellcats themselves, though thinly armored, seemed to vanish and reappear with uncanny speed, darting in and out of the fight like wolves among giants. Farther north, at St. Vith, the 84th Tank Destroyer Battalion fought a desperate delaying action. Their M36 Jacksons, armed with 90mm guns, engaged Panthers at ranges beyond 2 kilometers. Each shot was a thunderclap. Each hit a flash of triumph in the white landscape of ruin. Casualties were staggering, half their strength lost, but 30 Panthers were destroyed in the brutal stand. The men held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive, changing the course of the German offensive. Even the older M10s, considered obsolete by this stage of the war, found their moment. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion faced relentless assaults. For 2 days they battled, firing from frozen emplacements, shells crashing into advancing tigers. 17 German tanks were destroyed before the enemy pulled back, leaving twisted wreckage scattered across the snow. The ridge held, and with it, the hope of containing the Bulge. Yet glory came at a cost. In the Ardennes alone, 119 tank destroyers were lost. 86 of them were towed guns, abandoned in mud and snow, their crews powerless against the tide of German armor. But the statistics told a different story. In the same campaign, tank destroyer battalions destroyed more than 300 German tanks. For every machine lost, 2 or 3 of the enemy were consumed in fire. These battles revealed the paradox of the tank destroyer. Designed for ambushes against massed breakthroughs that never came, they found their worth in improvisation, supporting infantry, reinforcing crumbling lines, rushing to plug holes at the last moment. They were not the silver bullet doctrine had promised. But in the crucible of Saint-Lô, Mortain, Bastogne, and Saint-Vith, they proved something else. They proved that thin-skinned hunters, manned by determined crews, could defy even the most fearsome predators of steel. And yet, as the smoke cleared over Europe's battlefields, another question rose. If the tank destroyers had fought so fiercely, why then did the army begin to doubt their very existence? When the thunder of battle finally faded, the tank destroyer force stood at a crossroads. Their record was written in fire and steel, hundreds of enemy tanks knocked out, countless infantry attacks blunted, desperate defenses held long enough for victory to take root. Yet their reputation was anything but secure. In the ruins of El Getter, commanders remembered the bravery of the 601st, but also the sight of burning half-tracks and shattered crews. General George Patton himself dismissed them as unsuccessful, unwilling to see fragile machines as the equals of tanks. In Italy, tank destroyers fired thousands of high-explosive shells in support of infantry, acting less as hunters and more as mobile artillery. Some officers grumbled that the doctrine had failed before it ever truly began. The arrival of the M10 Wolverine and the swift Hellcat seemed to offer new hope. But even these machines bore scars of design. Open-topped turrets left crews vulnerable to shrapnel and small arms. Thin armor gave them speed, but at a price. In France, soldiers piled sandbags atop their vehicles, strapped on spare track links, welded makeshift covers to shield themselves from death raining down. It was an improvisation born of necessity, a silent admission that the doctrine had not fully prepared them for reality. By the time the M36 Jackson appeared, bristling with a 90mm gun that could smash panthers at long range, the tide of war was already turning. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the snows of Ardennes, tank destroyers proved their worth time and again. But alongside them rolled a new generation of Sherman tanks, now armed with the very same 76mm guns once thought unique to the Wolverines. The distinction blurred. Was there truly a need for a separate branch, for a force built around vehicles so similar to tanks, yet designed to be something different? In January 1945, the answer began to take shape. The Army ordered many of its towed battalions to be converted into self-propelled units, acknowledging that immobile guns could not survive in the fluid, punishing battles of Europe. The move was both practical and symbolic, a quiet retreat from the doctrine of 1941. On the battlefield, the men carried on. They fought through the Siegfried Line, their guns hammering fortifications, their shells tearing into concrete bunkers as readily as they had pierced German steel. They stood at Ramagen, covering the bridge that would open the road into Germany's heart. They fought until the last days of the war, when burning cities replaced burning tanks, and the sound of engines gave way to the silence of surrender. But even as victory was declared, the question could not be ignored. The tank destroyer had been conceived as a weapon of necessity, a solution to a nightmare that never fully materialized. The sweeping panzer breakthroughs of Poland and France had not come again. Germany, battered and defensive, no longer hurled its tanks forward in massive waves. The hunters had waited for prey that rarely appeared. 3 months after the guns fell silent in Europe, the U.S. Army made its decision. The tank destroyer branch was dissolved. Fort Hood shifted its mission. The doctrine was shelved, its champions quieted. The future, it was declared, lay not in specialized hunters, but in versatile machines, main battle tanks that could carry the fight across every field of war. For the men who had fought in open turrets, who had endured the roar of shells and the sting of shrapnel, the decision was bittersweet. Their battalions had written stories of courage in Tunisia, Normandy, and the Ardennes. Yet history seemed determined to view them as a failed experiment, a concept overtaken by time. The battlefields told a different story. Rows of panthers and tigers left burning, testimony carved in iron and ash. But the verdict of doctrine was final. The tank destroyer, born of fear and forged in fire, would vanish almost as swiftly as it had appeared. The war ended, but the memory of the tank destroyer lingered, caught between admiration and doubt. Within months of victory, the branch itself was gone, disbanded as if erased from the army's future. Yet the machines and the men who fought in them could not be so easily forgotten. Their story carried forward, woven into the larger tapestry of lessons learned in blood. In Korea, the roar of the M36 Jackson echoed once more. Against Soviet-built T-34s, its 90mm gun proved deadly, reminding commanders that the hunters of Europe still had teeth. Across the globe, surplus vehicles found new homes, sold or given to nations rebuilding their armies. On distant battlefields, long after their official obituary had been written, American tank destroyers continued to fight under foreign flags. But perhaps their most enduring legacy lay not in steel, but in doctrine. The experiment had revealed the danger of over-specialization. Machines built for one task, no matter how vital, risked becoming obsolete when the shape of war shifted. The German blitzkrieg that had terrified planners in 1940 never returned in its original form. Instead, the struggle became one of attrition, combined arms, and adaptability. Tank destroyers had to bend themselves to new roles: artillery, infantry support, rapid reaction, proving useful only because their crews refused to be bound by rigid theory. Historians argued over their place. Some dismissed them as a failure, pointing to open turrets, thin armor, and heavy losses. Others countered with the numbers: battalions that destroyed hundreds of tanks, kill ratios that outshone the Shermans they fought beside. The truth lay in between. They were both flawed and formidable, a paradox of war. Most of all, they left a mark on the evolution of armored warfare. From their ashes rose the concept of the main battle tank, one vehicle that could do it all: fight armor, support infantry, hold ground. The lessons carved out in the deserts of Tunisia and the snow of the Ardennes shaped the design of post-war giants like the M26 Pershing, and beyond it, the tanks that would dominate the Cold War. Today, rusting hulks of M10s, M18s, and M36s stand silent in museums and memorials. Their open turrets face the sky, reminders of men who fought with courage inside fragile shells. To some, they are symbols of a failed idea. To others, they are proof that determination can turn even flawed weapons into instruments of victory. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the tank destroyer. Not that it was perfect, nor eternal, but that it showed how, in the crucible of war, resolve and adaptability mattered more than steel itself.